Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a giant book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, make jokes, have fun, analyze, try and figure it out. Apparently drink a little wine as we do so when it's the afternoon where we are. It is not early morning.
It's already 5 p.m.
Already 5 p.m. This is the 19th season of the 2-Month Review, and we are finishing up The Remembered Part by Rodrigo Fresán. This is our penultimate episode. Next week, we will conclude with this book and move on to season number 20 in September, which, as I mentioned before, is all about Mulligan Stew by Gilbert Sorrentino. Get your copy now. Amazing book. But I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined this week by Kaija Straumanis, also from Open Letter Books, also here in Latvia. How are you doing, Kaija?
Oh, great. I just had a disheveled because I had an argument with a self-checkout monitor about buying spices. So that felt great.
Yeah.
I'm an adult person yelling at a self-checkout machine.
Well, I mean, they don't usually work very well. So, and
no,
and I don't think you should trust Eastern European technology anyways. It's probably feeding every time that you scan something on that self-checkout, the info probably goes to Russia and they use it to elect Trump. So I would watch it. You only use cash and never smile. These are the things I understand about this country.
Through my purchases of cumin and other things. Yeah. Anyway, yes. Otherwise, doing well. Little bummed because the time in Latvia is coming to an end, but also, yeah, it was. I feel good. So
we are going to be talking about pages 7 up to 700, which is part 3. But before we get into that, why don't you, because we're working on this right now, this next year, so one of the things that we started at Open Letter last summer was the translator triptych, which last summer, Katie Whittemore, former 2-Month Review co-host, had 3 books that she translated come out from 3 Spanish women, Wolfskin by Laura Moreno, Bad Handwriting by Sarah Mesa, and Mothers Don't by Katisha Aguirre. And this year we have 3 books that are coming out that are curated by Janet Hong, all from South Korea, Year After Year, Wafers, and Rena. I'll have to look up the authors' names for those ones because I don't have it down right now in front of me. But next summer, you will be doing a triptych of Latvian books. So do you want to talk for a second about the 3 books that you chose and what they are? They're not quite available for sale yet, but they will be within the next month. So there you go.
Yes. Yeah. We're found out that one of the authors is going to be at Frankfurt, and they're going to be doing some events with her because the book is coming out in German. So galleys will be available at Frankfurt for anyone who is listening and who will be there and who will be interested. Yeah. So the Latvian triptych, there are 3 books that I chose that I think really reflect Latvian authors' ability to work with short story format or just shorter formats. So there are 2 short story collections and 1 kind of near novella, I guess.
Cut that.
And it's you can cut it, it's fine. But I don't like the word novella, and it's a novel, but it's a short novel. And the short novel is The River, or River by Laura Vinogradova. Then there is Berlin by Andris Kupriš, which is one of the short story collections. And then the 3rd book is Birthday by Jana Egle. And all 3 books are very different but very, very good. Jana Egle's work is she's a bit older, and in comparison to the other 2 authors, and her stories are they're not midlife crisis, but I think they made me very uncomfortable in a way while reading them about the coming of older age, but it made me uncomfortable in a way that I liked. It kind of had that sort of delightful, creepy feeling to it, and creeping feeling of time. And that book is translated by a friend of mine, Uldis Baluadis, and he has had a couple other translations come out. most notably from Vagabond Voices by Zygmunt Squinch, a book called Nakedness. So this will be, I'm excited to, Squinchy. I'm very excited to work with Oldest because he and I have known each other for several years. He was one of the people I met and became friends with once Latvian literature started bringing us over for the translation workshops. He's also a linguist. His husband's a writer, so like super talented, very, very knowledgeable, very well-read with language and literature. And so I'm very excited that he worked on that book. Berlin is the other short story book by Andris Kopriš. And this one, it has sort of a bleak travel weariness to it. Everything feels kind of rainy and dreary, and I think the kind of vibe is about displacement and not really having a place where you belong, be that internally or externally. And the translator who translated that is Ian Gwynn. He is involved with the Scandinavian Studies department at the University of Washington, and he was also my mentee a couple years ago. And this is the book that he chose to work on. So we had, I think, like a 6-month mentorship where we talked about translating and about Latvian literature, and then they gave us a bunch of books. And this was the one that he picked, and I think that it's a really great fit for him. I'm glad he chose this one. We ended up, by the end of the mentorship, only doing one short story because he picked one that was so packed and loaded that we spent the 6 months working on that as opposed to working on the full book. So I'm very excited to be bringing this one on. And this author, Andris Kopriš, I want to say this was his first collection also. So that's also exciting to be able to bring that out. And then the short novel that I translated is by author Laura Vinogradova, and it's great. And I'm terrible at describing my own projects, but it's this it's just great. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to spend the next half hour digging myself into a hole. But all 3 of these books, I don't know why it sort of comes in fits and starts, but I think that truly the short story format or the short fiction format, Latvian authors have that locked down. I don't know why. I'm not saying that the longer books are terrible, but I think they really, their abilities as writers really, really shine through in these short formats. And something I've been thinking of recently because of the whole Latvian Eastern European face is that all 3 of these books also can superficially seem very like briefly put or not, just like short story collections, but there is an undercurrent of emotionality and psychology going on in there where, just like to use the example with Ian's story, we spent 6 months just getting to the point essentially of him translating the short story in full because there was so much to unpack and so much the sort of undercurrent and subtext of how these people are writing. It's marvelous, and I kind of love that. So it makes me feel a little bit better about myself also, and the nation of stoic, expressionless faces that we are, that we really do have a lot of stuff, a lot of feelings and thoughts going underneath the surface. And I think that a lot of that actually does come from the time when, during the Soviet Union, where poets and writers were writing things in subtext because everything was censored. And this is just a theory of mine. I have no research on this, but I'm starting to feel like, yeah, of course, they'd be good at writing these superficially, simple, straightforward texts, but the subtext is where it's at. So I'm very excited to understand more of why I chose these 3 books. And I'm excited to have 2 relatively new Latvian to English translators working on them. I'm just excited to be able to get their names in the pool as well. They're both great.
Yeah, and I believe that all 3 of the authors were born under the Soviet Union as part of part of that, even though that's a while ago now. It's still not long.
I think
their late 30s.
Yeah, and I think both Andres and Laura for sure are like our age. But Jana Egle, she's like our parents' age, I think. So it's not that much older, but she would have been a teenager essentially, I think.
Right. I just looked, and according to the translation database, which is always undergoing revising and updating, there are 9 Latvian books total that are show up in here.
We're gonna bring it to a full dozen. Yeah.
Wow, you're gonna up that by a third.
Wow, yeah, flash flood warning, guys.
Pretty wild. We'll try and have like one galley with all 3 books in it that will be available for booksellers and reviewers. If you're interested, you can always reach out and contact. Otherwise, stay tuned because those will be available through the website in the not too distant future. Anyways, I was going to ask about Latvia's lack of irony, but I'm not going to go into that right now. We'll just wait until
that sounds like a very specific question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe it does. But anyways, let's talk about this book, and then we'll preview a little bit of like the later things. So I know you didn't read this. You've been dragged in here because Brian had another family medical thing to deal with. So you're just sucked in. But you can maybe talk to and respond to a few things. And this is better than last week, in which I talked to myself for 45 minutes. And I don't think a single soul has watched, listened, or downloaded that podcast. So that's good.
I mean, I talk to myself on a regular basis, probably for that long, at least sometimes out loud, sometimes inside my head. And I'm hoping no one's listening to it because it is treacherous territory, this brain of mine.
So this section is a pretty short bit that we're going over today because we extended last week to get to the end of part 2. But this is part 3, the final part of the triptych, the final part of the book, and the final part of his triptych. And the title is Inventing What Will Happen Because You Can No Longer Keep Inventing What Already Happened. And having read the book and full of stars, Bon Voyage, my friend, opens with his usual slew of epigraphs from all sorts of random people. But this is a section that it's written slightly different. So instead of like in part 1 was one long monologue, essentially on the plane. Part 2 had a lot of these like titles that then were like references, or like a title that then was the basis for a meditation underneath that, and sort of kept recapping things that you already knew, but it wasn't all like one extended rant voice. And the third one, this one has these little characters. For those who are watching, you can see this little I don't remember if he calls them beauty characters or whatnot, because I think they're a different one. A Chinese symbol that he uses that does it actually describe it? Not really. But he uses that to separate out different parts. And this one is more third person-y and explaining sort of like what actually is going on, like how it got to the point that we've been at. So in the beginning, it does have like right away a reference to the sort of chronology, which is all jacked up in this book. So as a quote, that's why people tend to talk, or he's like everything here and right now, and final and ending. And endings were and are and would be ever be more crystalline and clear than beginnings. That's why people tend to talk more about happier sad endings than about happier sad beginnings. The sadness or the happiness of beginnings is always transitory and fleeting and never stays still. It's there only to shift, to change location and mood and intensity. Nobody asks, how did it all begin? Because there's no need. Because asking, how did it all end? You know everything from the first minute to the last second. Yet the condition or nature of the ending is not known or specified until the last letter of the last line. So it's building into the idea of like things completing. And like I talked about last week to myself, this one does go back to the plot a little bit, and still off screen, but a little less off screen, a little bit pulling it more in. Mm-hmm. And in short, if we're getting into like any of the specific parts of this, in short, he has decided to leave his home. Well, I'll walk you through a bit. So this section does go through and explains what happens. So it kept referring to in the earlier parts what happened with his book, The Impossible Story, that led to his having to be in exile. And this one gives that story. And again, in the same way that we did with the Rochester section, with different bits that like really did take place in his life, it is that, but like manipulated slightly. So do you remember the invented part story of the gift?
It's been so long. So I'm gonna go with no.
Oh yeah. So when the invented part came out in Spain, or it had been out for a short period of time, I think. In Spain on St. George's Day, the tradition is that you give everyone, I mean, I think it used to be that you give women a rose and a book. Now everyone gives everyone a book. It's like the big purchasing day for books and for gift giving of that sort, and the roses go along with it, and so on and so forth. And it's like a big celebration. I think it's like April 22nd, something like that. St. George's Day. So I'll do a Fresán and digress for a second. So St. George's Day is St. George chopped the head off the dragon, right? That's his claim to fame of helping save things, making him a saint. He chopped the head off a dragon, whatever.
Very real animal in Catalonia.
Yeah, I don't remember the whole story of this, but I just know that he is associated with that imagery. St. George Dragon Slayer shows up, which is not dissimilar from your St. George and the Dragon. Yeah, he's a soldier venerated in Christianity who defeats a dragon. Now that I think about it, like that's fucking insane. Like there aren't fucking dragons. Like most of these
exactly.
like saints are generally like they do miracles and perform miracles, but you can sort of maybe like allow for those miracles. But defeating a dragon is really not like
it was probably just like a really ratty goat or something. And like, okay, you get to be a saint by just like making up a story like, oh, this is what I did. Whereas women historically have like had to like chop their boobs off to make a point. That's not fair.
I am confused now. I never really thought about it, but this is bizarre as shit. Anyways, he's a soldier venerated in, this is from Wikipedia. He defeats a dragon. The story goes that the dragon originally extorted tribute from villagers. When they ran out of livestock and trinkets for the dragon, they started giving up a human tribute once a year. This was acceptable to the villagers until a princess was chosen as the next offering. The saint thereupon rescues the princess and kills the dragon. The narrative was first set in Cappadocia in the earliest sources of the 11th and 12th centuries, but transferred to Libya in the 13th century Golden Legend. It has pre-Christian origins, so on and so forth. Somehow St. George.
Fairy tale. That's like...
Yeah, it's just fairy tale. It's in Russia, it's in Ethiopia, it's in various Western things. It shows up all over. So
it's in Shrek.
He's just Shrek. Yeah. Okay. Shrek. I saw some joke that Game of Thrones is just Shrek in real life. In live action. But actually, I've not seen either of those performances, whatever they might be. So Saint George is a saint, is a dragon slayer. And when the first time that Catalonia went to visit and like meet with official political figures from China, they brought a gift because you bring gifts between the ambassadors, so on and so forth. And I don't remember the story of what the Chinese gave the Catalans, but the Catalans gave them a Saint George like statue of St. George chopping the head off a dragon, which obviously a Chinese dragon means a lot more to China. So their interpretation of being handed this gift was that, Catalonia was coming to chop their head off with a giant sword, like a dragon slayer. Not good. But on St. George's Day or whatever, they give out these books. And some years ago now, after the invented part had been given out, during a time when there was like there still is, obviously, but there's a lot of tension between the Catalan separatist government and Madrid. The prime minister of Spain, who's based in Madrid, is Madrid-centric, gifted the representative from Catalonia a copy of the invented part with the subtext that their country is an invention and doesn't really exist and that it's not real. And this is on all the news outlets, and this was on was reported. Rodrigo's son saw it on TV and was like, look, there's a picture of it that we've used on this podcast and other places before. So this is doing a Fresán and rehashing that rehash story.
Yeah.
But the way that it's told in here is that same bit where they're giving up the thing. It doesn't ever say, he doesn't want to say like what country he's in. It's always referred to as like, even the city is B instead of Barcelona. There's a reference to that. But this ends up on, so he becomes like, his book becomes used by politicians, ends up on the newscasts and the newspapers. The impossible story in the hands of politicians. It's covered close up in videos and pictures. His title in a titular role in headlines, and his name in smaller print, and he once even misspelled by some on-call intern in the editorial office. There's a small but very high-level functionary in the general government, nothing more and nothing less than the vice president, making a gift of the impossible story. His last book, in accordance with the custom of a local ritual on a date stipulated by tradition, to the growing fury of feminists, many of them writers of Lo Feminino, when women gave books to men and men gave roses to women. So that's the original St. Geordie's thing, was the women get roses, men get books. So the vice president presented his book, obediently abiding by the rituals of the region, to the local male authorities, who accepted it with tense smiles, facing gusts of camera flashes. But what the vice president gave them wasn't a book to be read, it was a book to be looked at, a book that could indeed be judged by its cover. There's a photograph of his Mr. Trip on the book's cover, which is true of the invented part, and more and even better by its title, because the impossible story was a way to signal to the rebels and separatists in the region that theirs was a dream that would never come true, an impossible invention that would never function, a broken toy. And so in his telling of this, they're like, it goes on to like talk about the vice president. In any case, the vice president, who immediately had to be evacuated from the auditorium, which exploded with screams and threats, to a helicopter that flew her across the regional border, miscalculated the level of atmospheric pressure, and never suspected that her stunt with the impossible story would be the drop that would burst the dam and match that lit the fuse. And so everything goes haywire. There's people like get pissed. Everyone's trying to start a revolution, essentially. All of them making more clear that nobody had read it, but they're complaining about the book. The book is like incendiary, but all the people who are pontificating about it and the pundits have made it clear that they haven't read the book, because they described it as, quote, the true manifesto of the fascists from the Capitol, written by someone who, quote, didn't even know the language of our republic. So it's like, attacks him, so he's going to leave. So he decides what he's going to do is leave and go to Abracadabra, Mount Abracadabra, and visit the Karmas, where Penelope's people. So that's the sort of like, again, using a real life thing and sort of inverting it and twisting it, making it larger to like be able to use it as motivation. And this has been referenced so many times in here. And like, I knew that was the story because I knew the story of it. But in the book, if you aren't aware of that, like to get this on page, what even is it? 600 and whatever, 80 something, is kind of insane that's like where the plot point comes, but is very typical of the sort of like round and round and round we go, retelling and telling and referencing and re-referencing, but never necessarily going like, here's part A, here's what happens next, here's what happens after that sort of vibe, which is pretty fun.
Yeah. And I mean, I remember the gift story, not the part of the dragon getting beheaded, but
no, that is a story I know from a former politician who told me.
Yeah, but it's interesting because even though in like this rewind and retell, like, okay, I remember the part where Rodrigo's book was gifted, but I still learned something new because I didn't know this other part. And just like, I don't know any other writer who can repeat themselves this much and it doesn't get boring. It just doesn't. And that is commendable. I mean, Rodrigo is a wizard of words, and Will is also a wizard of words. I mean, I was looking at the next book of Rodrigo's that we're doing, Melvill, earlier today, and there's the very familiar, like the titular title and things like these sorts of word pairings. And I'm like, okay, I know I'm in a Rodrigo book and a Fresán book, but the feeling is so different from the Part trilogy. So there is this comfortable feeling, but also the knowledge that I'm going to be taken on a ride
So what is the next book?
Melvill, and it is
without an E.
Yes, Melvill without an E, and it is about Alan Melvill and Herman Melvill. And I feel kind of like the rise and fall, like the rise and fall of Alan Melvill, and then sort of is that just where Herman Melville has gotten all of his material is from, sort of hypothesizing, I believe, of Alan Melville, his father, telling him relaying all these life stories, repeating all these things that he's lived through, and Herman Melville using those as the material for his books. And I think it brings into question, I mean, Rodrigo plays a lot with literature and the literary sources. And I think it'll be interesting because obviously the Melvilles were real people. And so instead of using real people and then writing, this is going to sound so trite, but instead of using real people and then writing like the part trilogies, it's going to be very neat, I think, to see him using real people and then kind of hypothesizing.
I think I have a different angle than that. So the
Great. Prove me wrong. No.
Not proving you wrong, just a different angle. So yeah, so the jacket copy that you put together that is sent is about dying father, grip of a fever, telling his son, still a child, about all of his like adventures and journeys. And then the question is, could the work of Herman Melville, masterful author, misunderstood, far too ahead of his time, considered crazy and dangerous by some critics, have as its source the ultimate paternal legacy? And then it talks about fiction and then intricacies of fiction, and has what you're saying of like the real life sort of being passed down. But I think again, it's another book that's about father-son relationships.
Oh, absolutely.
Part it really is too. And in this section specifically, there is a bit that when he's talking about leaving, so he finally decides to leave Barcelona. He's going to go down in the funicular, which showed up in the invented part when he's going in the funicular and thinks he's having a heart attack and invents all these crazy ideas and so on and so forth. It talks about how there's pages are falling out of this fucking thing. I'm ready for this to be over simply because this book has become like unwieldy to hold. It is like a sheep.
We need to reprint it better.
He's going to to leave. There are a bunch of wild boars. And he talks about Cerdic. And he says Cerdic was a wild boar of a long lineage, and actually his name was Cedric. But when he invented him as a protagonist in a series of children's stories to put to sleep the small reality and awaken the immense dreams of night, the only recipient for those adventures, delivered in a fairly low voice, because he never put them in writing, had been that now lost boy with flame-colored hair, he whose name must not be mentioned, the son of Penelope, the other desperacito in the family. He'd said Cedric, and the boy had heard Cerdic, and Cedric went and Cerdic stayed. And he goes on to talk about the stories that he tells the boy, Penelope's son, his nephew, about this wild boar, or boar that like whatever his sort of like kid stories that he's telling to put him to sleep. And that seems reminiscent to then this Melville book in terms of like telling the story and passing along to another generation this sort of imagination and storytelling ability and whatnot. I think that ties in here because this book is really about trying to connect with Penelope's son and with like with a future. And in some ways it's trying to connect like as hard as it can with the readership, but with no belief in the future of the readers, and without any idea that feeling that there's no connection with them because of not being able to write like IKEA and not being able to do the things that they want. And then when he has this last book, it causes this outrage and nobody reads that either. They're just pissed about it. And he has to leave. Like there's like a disconnect between him and his audience. And yet like the desire to like pass something along comes through in this desire to find son. And last week, since I know you didn't listen to it either because nobody listened to it, which is fine.
I was busy looking for beach glass and helping a 5-year-old throw sticks into the sea.
If there's anyone that listened to it last week, Shit, now I forgot what I was going to say. You got me off track.
Please let Chad know so he can stop talking about how no one listened to it. Take a screen cap of your screen. Thank you, Ben Chambers.
I didn't know you could see those too. Ben Chambers, listen. So the one thing that I talked about in there is that in that last section, he sees a picture in the magazine on the plane of the mantra of the karmas and sees Penelope's son in that picture, and so decides not to go just to there for the reason of going back to Mount Abracadabra and to the karmas and all that, but also to try and find Penelope's son. So Penelope's son becomes the only sole motivation of this journey in this book of like flying across the continent from presumably Barcelona to, and he describes in this section the cities that he goes to, which I think have probably more significance than I even like gave them as I read it, but he names them as like getting to California and then going to Mexico, because he's going to go find them. And he has to go through, so he lands in Los Angeles, then goes to, oh shit, he says how to pronounce it, and I can't, oh, here it is. Zzyx, Z-Z-Y-X-Z, or sorry, Z-Z-Y-Z-X, pronounced Zzyx, is one city, which is amazing, because apparently, like, I don't know if this is a real place. I wouldn't be surprised if it is at all. I didn't have time to look it up. But it talks about the history of the place, which included a radio evangelist preacher of some fame and high levels of delirious and quacked out superstitious content. When Curtis House
quacked out?
Yeah, this says quacked out.
Quacked out.
One Curtis House Springer, who at the end of World War II filed a claim for those federal lands in the Mojave Desert and erected there a combination spa and religious retreat where, taking advantage of bubbling hot springs, later revealed to be fake, a series of pools Springer heated with a boiler, he offered cures for all manner of illness of the body and the soul, including cancer, baldness, and demonic possession. And hence up, all three are real. Ben Chambers is confirming they are real. So this has like all these different places. It's like a ghost town now, because it turned out that he was just a complete fraud and went to jail for it. And so then he goes to a place called Colma, which is literally just a huge cemetery, because outside of like where they couldn't build any more cemeteries. So basically this town is just essentially a cemetery. And then I forget what the third one is. It's right here though. I don't think I've gotten
I wonder what kind of tax breaks they get.
And the third one is Nothing. He goes to a place called Nothing, a city called Nothing, where there's no thing. But he's on his way to try and find Penelope's son. There is, okay, so I'll get back to one other thing. But this section, ironically, stopping on page 700, which is like truly random. It's just based on trying to divide number of pages up. The last paragraph is like kind of perfect, where the last two are better not to think, better to remember and forget about that Cambrai syndrome. We'll talk about that in a second. And so he tells Big Chief Bastille Hearst to take him back to the Los Angeles airport so he can fly first to Mexico City and from there continue on after a brief layover to Abracadabra to Mount Karma, to his final destination where events will do exactly what events most like to do. There, events were going to precipitate, so there would take place, and that place as final as Zzyx and Colma and Nothing, the last end of his world news. That's where he was going now in order to stop going anywhere. That's the part that we ended at reading this week, which is like the ultimate, like penultimate cliffhanger of time. Like that couldn't have been better fixed. But the other thing that was like a plot point that came up in a sly reference in the last week's section that shows up again here is that he has a brain tumor, and that's a part of like why he's the anger and the memory, the problems of slipping, the things of forgetting things. So the right before that, the horror that felt unjustified after he successfully made it through every annual checkup until all horror was justified and his checkup turned into a checkout, where he stared at the x-ray of his own skull like something that couldn't be true, that couldn't be his, that had to be someone else's, because in the end, all skulls were equal and death was the great equalizer. And he watched himself in that moment and he watched himself fall. And that the falling thing is what runs throughout here too. But that's the other part of this, is that he has this brain tumor, which I know the aforementioned Ben Chambers had asked about, like the mistakes and quirks in the text, which I will verify, but I think the majority of them are typos and not intentional. But if they're not, what's interesting is there's one in here where it refers to the secret life of Sebastian Knight, which is not the title of Nabokov's book. And in this section, it refers to the real life of Sebastian Knight, which is the title of the book. And that, if that is intentional, it's kind of interesting, of the secret and real life being played off one another. The 2000 Leagues Under the Sea thing, I think, is a typo, but I'm not sure. But there is like references to his mind going, his memory losing, not being able to remember the things. And this is all part of like this book being one long sort of meditation on this guy losing, trying to write down, trying to get everything out before he forgets everything, and it's all gone forever.
Yeah. And just like as a side note,
the gift that you give to the next generation.
Yeah, and as a side note, that's also, and I know Ben and I had emailed about similar things where it is hard to tell with Rodrigo sometimes what is intentional and what isn't. And that's a conversation that then obviously it gets had with the translator, but especially with this part of like the tumor and the wind down and things like that, it's even harder then if you introduce an actual like outside real life element such as cancer.
So that's the other plot point that sort of comes up in this section. Otherwise, like, so I don't know. I want
to take a moment and think about Rodrigo as a parent. So Rodrigo has a son. He and his wife have a son. And when you mentioned that back when we were touching on the Melvill manuscript, that is where it starts out essentially. And that is the first thing that I thought of, was like, okay, well, here in this book, I might end up seeing the parenting side of Rodrigo. So when I met Rodrigo the first time, I was pregnant. And then this next time I saw him, I had Alex. And I mean, he told me, we spent like the hour and whatever, 20 minutes together in the car driving to Ithaca and back. I think it was Ithaca. Yeah, Ithaca and back, or Buffalo and back. I don't know, maybe both. But he told me so many stories about that involved his son, and it was great. I mean, I had such a great time listening to him, and I want to. I don't think I've ever thought of him as a parent when I've been reading. But I think I want to. I think I want to keep that in mind, because there is that, that legacy aspect. And he does dedicate every single book to his son and to his wife. And I want to talk to him about how much being a parent factors into his own writing journey. Because I feel like I've missed a lot that I haven't caught earlier in his work.
Yeah, he likes when he talks about. I've heard him talk about his kid. The best part is that he doesn't. His kid can watch and read or do whatever he wants. There's no limitations. So his son watches things that American parents would be like, that's inappropriate for his age, and it's just like, no, it's like he loves watching the movie It, because that's a good movie for like where kids win and crazy shit like that. But yeah. Interesting. Speaking of that, the one other part that I wanted to reference was there is a section in here that's rather interesting about the differences between Arthur Clarke's novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, or I think it's just 2001, and then the Kubrick movie, and why that they had various fights about what would be there, and that Clarke wanted viewers to see the extraterrestrials and for everything to have a scientific and grounded logic. And the character in the book, the exwriter, says that immediately after seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey, he reads the book and is like, this book explains everything. It's trying to explain everything. Whereas Kubrick was trying to do something where he wanted his film to be like something narrated by a superior and extraterrestrial intelligence. And for that reason, something that could never be entirely comprehensible to the far more inferior human intellect. Thus, not a film about the definitively alien, but a definitively alien film. It's also, which is fun, since yesterday there's a nice hearing in the Senate about how the U.S. has various alien bodies and spacecraft. Just the whistleblower moment of like, oh yeah, shit, man, we got all sorts of stuff. They were supposed to talk about, but yeah, no worries.
And that saint who claimed to have chopped off a dragon's head, that dragon's real.
The dragon was probably a ET or whatever.
The body is there.
Body's all, yeah.
We have another comment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the comment is that with the narrator being an alternate version of himself, it's difficult not to speculate on the real life and the relationships. And I actually don't know this, but I don't think that Rodrigo has or had a sibling. I don't think he's ever mentioned that.
No,
but I always
which is
the Penelope part as being actually a nod to the Philip K. Dick story, where Philip K. Dick did have a twin who died, and he believes is part of him, and that he's always writing both of these parts, and one is like the yin sort of side and the yang sort of side, and like they're very different. And Penelope is obviously very popular, and like there's certain similarities, but it's a whole different thing. I don't know why I was always fixated on that.
Yeah, I mean,
but yeah,
it could be,
it's like, well, yeah, it was there for that. But the same thing happens with Dubravka Greshik's books, where she would tell stories about things that happen, and then, or like I'd be there when they happen, and then they would show up in the essays later, just reworked or like retried out. Like there's various ones about trying to get that ETSA thing from the airport, not being able to do it. And I think she must have told me that story like 3 times before it showed up in an essay, and it just kept getting better and more like tweaked each time. So it's like a lot of writers of this nature that are like pulling in things that are real, but also fictionalizing them obviously at the same time. Anything else that you
I think
wanted
it's interesting to think about thinking now about the yin yang aspect of like, and you know, speculating about Rodrigo's real life and relationships. It is interesting to have then, if we can guess or maybe say that Rodrigo sees himself in the writer, in the author, and then IKEA is the nemesis, and Penelope is the yang or the yin, whatever the successful version of it is. And there are that's so many parts of yourself and idealized parts of yourself that you're fighting with. It's like the id, ego, superego trio. And oh my God, he's so good. It's just so much. You could spend the next 10 years unpacking Rodrigo Fresán.
Yeah, the other part that's funny that I really like that and I think we can maybe reference this in a minute, but he talks about working for Bolaire magazine, which is referenced a billion times out here, but this time it's referenced as in a wholly different way. Bolaire had been a great training in false nonfictions for his true fictions that would come later. To depart without leaving the desk in the corner of an editorial office, a space where he and his 9 pseudonyms, including women in multiple nationalities and even different sexual orientations, looked at photographs and studied tourist guidebooks and invented more or less realistic comings and goings. So within the context of this, he, for this travel magazine, just made shit up and had various pseudonyms that wrote things for this ex-writer for that. And I would love, I mean, that's one of my favorite things, is having like a fake pseudonym that can write stuff and can speak for you. There's been a few. There's been a few. I can't remember Kim's last name anymore.
Kimmy.
Don't call me Kimmy.
Hamilton Cox.
Kim Hamilton Cox was Kimmy. One of the greatest creations that Open Letter ever had, who was our quote-unquote PR person for a short period of time. And until she got pissed because I kept referring to her as Kimmy, and she didn't want to be called Kimmy. And then she went to AWP and decided that AWP is filled with like just desperate asshole writers, and she didn't want a part of this business anymore. So she went on to dentistry school. But for a short period of time, Kim Hamilton Cox was like all over promoting our books to reviewers and booksellers alike.
I miss Kimmy.
Kimmy was wonderful. I think he was around when we started working with Rodrigo, because I think he was like, is this real? And I was like, no, it's not. Like, no, I just write with no periods is all you have. Like, it's just like a really simple trick that you just don't use punctuation the same way, and like it sounds different all of a sudden, but like and you put a name on it and people react differently. All fun and games. Those were fun times. Now it's like all
those are fun times. I have two questions. One, has Rodrigo ever read Volodine?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't remember.
I
mean, I don't know.
They're both so different. Just the pseudonyms thing made me wonder. And two, it was two. Volodine and why are these not audiobooks?
Do you know how long it take to read this?
So the one guy did JR, like, and he's a pro. We should get him to do these.
Yeah, you got $40,000 to pay him.
I mean, it wouldn't be for us. We'd be selling the rights, right? Why isn't Tantor Media heard about this series?
I think Rodrigo should read it himself. Rodrigo should record it himself.
Man, poor guy already wrote it all. Why would he want to read it all?
I'll just sit and read it aloud. Okay, so yeah, that would be fun to like have an audiobook. It would also be like, I can't even imagine how many hours this one would be. This is as 3 sets, much longer than JR. It's much longer. JR has like the voices that go with it. Yeah. This would be just like straight reading for a very long time. It might only be hard to listen to as an audiobook.
Would you do a different voice for the typewriter font, or would you do? Yeah. Okay.
It'd have to sound like yeah. I like Ben's right. If Rodrigo were reading it, he would digress and invent new stories on everything for sure. So I have a line of the week. That's not even really that funny, but I kind of like it. Not long ago, on the most jagged peaks of his insomnia, he tried a medication. His name didn't matter in the same way that a time always came when the names of ex-girlfriends didn't matter. Ex-girlfriends and ex-medications all end up the same, irrespective of their hypothetical function, pleasant or placebo in a given moment. I just think it's funny. As someone who can't remember anyone's fucking name, I'm there for it. So anyways, next week, finish this book. We will wrap it up. Brian will hopefully be here to summarize. He wants to talk about the World Cup and about which we'll know if the U.S. women's team pulls through. I do want to point out that watching the World Cup here is actually kind of easy because Latvia, being a misogynistic country that it is, has 0 TV stations willing to air the Women's World Cup. So seemingly, as a result, FIFA makes all of the streams available online for free if you're in this country. So as long as you're here, you can just access their website and watch all the games without having to like subscribe to Fox or something. So that's pretty cool. Weird how we got here, but like,
thanks, chauvinists.
Even when I went to the bar before I found this out to try and watch a game, they had to get like the stream from like BN Sports from another country because it was not even on the BN Sports here. It was like BN Sports from somewhere else. So yeah, fun times. Good job, guys. Good jobs. I mean, it is worth noting that Latvia's women's soccer team is pretty bad historically, like very bad. Last year they had their biggest loss ever, 20-0. So the struggle is real. But the Women's World Cup is awesome. Super fun to watch. Next week we'll finish this up, and then again the season after, starting in September, will be Mulligan Stew. If you subscribe to the Delkey newsletter, you'll get information about how to get a discount on that, which I'll post as soon as I can. But the new version of Mulligan Stew is available as a Delkey Essential. It's sexy as hell. Feels great to hold. It's going to be a trip to read. And in the meantime, go back and download and listen over and over again to the one where I did it by myself, because that would be fun. It's like a try, because if you don't listen, I'm just going to do it again and again and again until it works. Like that's like it works. Moses.
How long can people stay away from 2-month review? At some point, they're just going to give in. And they'll just take your solo career without any question.
You can see the hits just dropping to zero. It's just asymptotic curve towards nothingness. Like it's like the equivalent of like memory when you have a brain tumor. Like it's all going, gone. And on that note, why don't you rate and review us, follow us on Twitter and wherever else you might get information. We will be back next week with the end. Thank you very much.